former candidate for the U.S. Senate, longtime radio talk show host, author, and conservative policy advocate.
Justices to the Supreme Court, the left has been in open panic.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Joe Biden can run, but can he hide for the rest of the presidential campaign? Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. The presumptive Democratic presidential nominee has been holed up in his basement doing the occasional friendly interview laced with softball questions. We'll consider the question of when and how he needs to emerge, and we'll examine the state of the race via polls and odds makers when we're joined by LibertyNation.com Managing Editor Mark Angelides. Plus, the 1619 Project, once a radical vanity project of the New York Times, is now gaining frightening currency as radicals dominate the national conversation. LibertyNation.com international correspondent Onar Am will join us to discuss what the 1619 Project is and how it turns history on its head. Plus, our legal affairs editor, Scott Cosenza, jumps on board for Talkin' Liberty.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
We kick things off with our signature segment, Say What, where we roll out a virtual assembly line of wacky, astonishing, damnable, and ultimately revealing things uttered by politicians and the chattering class. The candidacy of Joe Biden, presumptive Democratic nominee for President of the United States, has started to come into sharper focus as we edge closer to the Republican and Democratic conventions in these next weeks and the start of the full campaign after Labor Day. And it's been ugly for Biden this week, particularly one indiscreet remark that seemed to reconfirm what Biden said weeks ago, that if you're not voting for him, you're not black. This time, he dropped a super gaffe that all but proclaims that he has the black vote all wrapped up because, unlike other minority groups, they all think the same way. And President Trump provided an apt response.
What you all know, but most people don't know, unlike the African-American community, with notable exceptions, the Latino community is an incredibly diverse community.
If I ever said that, they'd run me out of town. I'd be gone.
He's lost a few steps, I think, Mr. President. He can't figure out his numbers. Sometimes he can't even figure out what state he's in.
I don't quite get it, but whatever. 6 times with the wrong states. You do that, that's game-changing.
It's a pattern.
But not for him.
And as if saying blacks basically all think and act alike and therefore will all vote for him, the former vice president melted down when he was asked by a CBS reporter about the increasingly urgent issue of his cognitive ability and whether he's taken a cognitive test.
No, I haven't taken a test. Why the hell would I take a test? Come on, man. That's like saying before you got in this program, if you take a test where you're taking cocaine or not, what do you think, huh? Are you a junkie?
What do you...
Look, come on, man. I know you're trying to goad me.
I've been tested and I'm constantly tested. Look, all I got to do is watch me, and I can hardly wait to compare my cognitive capability to the cognitive capability of the man I'm running against.
It's fair to say that Donald Trump is likely more anxious than Biden to compare their cognitive capabilities. But how will the American people do it? Well, usually primarily through presidential debates. But we're getting increasing indications that Biden will try to get out of the 3 debates already on the schedule for September and October. How? Maybe by saying Trump just lies too much, as one leftist wrote recently, or that he must release his long-sought tax returns first, as a New York Times writer opined, or even as the once respected but now completely discredited D.C. inside journalist Elizabeth Drew wrote recently, debates just aren't a good way to pick a president. She apparently had an epiphany after decades of covering presidential debates. And let me tell you, the Biden campaign has been taking its cues from their friends in the elite media, so you can fully expect the talk about debate somehow being unfair to Biden will grow by the day. But we're now just days away from Biden announcing arguably the most important decision of his campaign. Who will be his running mate? The woman, and it will be a woman, almost certainly a black woman who can check the most identity politics boxes, who would serve as vice president. We're told it's down to a final two, former UN Ambassador Susan Rice or the odds-on favorite, California Senator Kamala Harris, who was treated to a softball interview on MSNBC, and here's what she said in positioning herself to be Biden's running mate.
If we have a president who is petty, he's petty, but also there's something about Donald Trump that is just the antithesis of what we want as an American leader and as our president, which is we want a president who has a generosity of spirit. There's nothing about Donald Trump that is generous. He's generous to himself, but he has no generosity toward an icon, a hero who has been described as a saint, John Lewis, or the American people, quite frankly, when you look at his policies. We have someone who is so self-involved instead of someone who is lifting up the spirit of the American people.
Kamala Harris was a disaster as a presidential candidate, but Biden has boxed himself in by saying he'll pick a woman and, in effect, that he must pick a woman of color. But if you listen to the tenor of her remarks there, it's clear that the Biden campaign will try and sell their candidate as a nice guy, civic-minded, and decent, unlike Trump. There's almost no talk about Biden's policies among his transparent supporters in the elite media, so they're going to try to make this a character election. But how is Biden planning to win when he can no longer do the very thing that made him a successful politician for almost 5 decades? Lawrence Jones of Fox News says Biden is clearly not the same guy he once was.
As a guy that was elected to office for 47 years, he was once known as the greatest retail politician. The campaigns would want him out talking with people. His press aides loved him talking to the press, even though sometimes he would turn some heads. He had a strategic way of connecting with people. That has since changed. They do not want him talking with the press. When he talks with the press, they are layups that they set up for him. They do not want him out talking with people because of the scene or the potential of them asking questions. And so there is a different Joe Biden. I think they have to be honest about that and plan a strategy to combat that.
The strategy has been to keep Biden out of sight, out of mind, barely in touch, and only for friendly interviews in his basement. How long can that last? Will people vote for someone who won't come out of his basement? Well, we've never had to ask that question before. But Biden will have to carry his whole party on his back, and that includes statements like this one from the once respectable member of Congress and civil rights crusader James Clyburn, comparing Trump to Benito Mussolini, the infamous fascist, and saying Trump's in bed with another Hitler and will never, ever leave the White House.
The facts are very clear. He says he was on the phone, 7 or 8 times with Putin recently. Nobody knows what he's talking about. Is he getting instructions from Putin? What's he talking about on the phone? And if you look at the way he is carrying out this presidency, you'll kind of see what I mean when I say Putin is Hitler and he's Mussolini. This guy intends to install himself under emergency powers or whatever he can use to be president for life.
That, folks, is the definition of a paranoid conspiracy theory. It's one thing if you heard that from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but that guy James Clyburn used to be respectable. But now, Trump deranged like everyone else on the left. Meanwhile, on the other side, conservatives are again panicked about the Supreme Court following a succession of head-shaking or incomprehensible decisions from the Chief Justice John Roberts, who's become the swing vote on the court and has sided with the leftist justices more and more in recent months. Vice President Pence said on the Christian Broadcasting Network that conservatives thrilled with the appointments of Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh to the High Court are now worried again because of John Roberts.
Chief Justice John Roberts has been a disappointment to conservatives, whether it be the Obamacare decision or whether it be a spate of recent decisions all the way through Calvary Chapel. It's a reminder, and I think several cases out of the Supreme Court are a reminder of just how important this election is for the future of the Supreme Court. We remember the issue back in 2016, which I believe loomed large in voters' decisions between Hillary Clinton and the man who would become president of the United States. And some people thought that it wouldn't be as big an issue these days, but I think that's all changed.
Indeed, it has. And in a perverse sense, Roberts going soft or even leftward may turn out to be a blessing for Trump because it will once again fire up right-of-center voters who now know they will need at least one more conservative justice to secure the court for the coming generation. Stay right there, because when we return, we'll ask and hopefully answer the question of whether the tide has started turning for President Trump in the 2020 presidential election.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
So what to make of all those polls showing Joe Biden in the lead, or more likely Trump trailing, since almost no one's enthusiastic about Joe Biden? As we approach Election Day in less than 3 months, almost all the polls were wrong in the last election, and what exactly has changed this time? What have these polling firms changed since 2016 that should make us trust them this time around after their historic failure last time around? Joining us to discuss this is the polling and gaming analyst for LibertyNation.com, among his other titles, and author of the Political Horse Race series, including the latest edition entitled Has the Tide Turned for Trump? That is Mark Angelides, and he joins us now. Hello, Mark.
Hi, Tim. Thanks for having me on.
Always a pleasure. Now, you write that polls are starting to tighten in the presidential election, and maybe they'll continue to tighten, but what can you point to in the way of a trend rather than just a blip on the radar?
Well, that's the interesting thing. A lot of people are looking at blips, but what you should really be looking for is the trends. And that's what I try and do. So if you look at the averages week on week from all of the polling, literally all of it, then it was around 9.5 to 10.5% leads for Biden back in early July. It's down to around about 6 or 7% for Biden. What we're not seeing anymore is a lot of these 14-point or 15-point leads. So the averages show that there's a definite contraction. The race is getting much closer.
Well, you write, quote, as riots rage across the country, it seems Trump's law and order agenda is convincing those who are trying to deal with the devastation. On what basis do you make that claim?
Again, that's due to digging deeper into the polls. So when the pollees are asked, for example, things like who's best at dealing with COVID or racial fairness, that they hand it over to Biden, that he wins those hands down. But in the same polling, these people are saying they don't want like a lawless state. They actually do want police in the community, and they want them well funded. So COVID, it's on its way out, and it'll become less of an issue the closer we get to November. But crime, and this is mostly in Democrat strongholds, of course, getting close to the election, it's actually going up. So when you hear Joe Biden calling police or law enforcement the enemy, he's backing very much the wrong horse if he wants to win.
Now, we all know the polls were famously, historically wrong in 2016, that even the pollsters admitted their polling was essentially broken. What, if anything, have these polling firms done in the meantime to repair what was broken and revive confidence in their ability to make meaningful forecasts? And which of the polls, in your view, objectively are the most reliable?
Well, so firstly, strangely, I think very few pollsters have really changed their tactics in how they run their methodologies. But in terms of the most reliable, I'd have to say it's Rasmussen. See, they focus only on likely voters. And their method, what it does, it takes a realistic number of the actual Republican voters into account. So most of your polling, almost all of it, in fact, shows that there is 24% for GOP voters, which is way below Democrat voters and independents. So all these polls give Biden a higher edge. But Rasmussen, they actually base their proportions of Republican voters on the 2016 and 2018 exit polls, which showed that there were 33%, both in 2016 and 18. So what you end up with is 9% of voters who just aren't being counted.
Now, in trying to broaden the perspectives of the political state of not just the U.S., but the Western world writ large, do you think the last British election, when the left and Jeremy Corbyn were thoroughly repudiated, might serve as some sort of a canary in the coal mine forecaster for the election here, the way Brexit did in 2016?
Probably, yeah. I mean, after the Brexit vote, we had general elections. And despite the fear building, the scare stories, and the constant reminder by the media of what a terrible idea the Brexit vote was, Boris Johnson, he won an 80-seat majority based off saying, I'll get Brexit done. They all wanted a return to the status quo, to stay in the EU, to stay within the European Union. And I think that's the real key here for this election as well, Tim. Do voters want a return to the status quo?
Okay, this has been fun, but we've run out of time. Mark, as always, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Tim.
Mark Angelides, managing editor of LibertyNation.com. Quick break, and then we'll return to discuss an obscure neo-Marxist project started by the New York Times that is now driving the deconstructionist conversation on the left, the 1619 Project.
Ready, set, go.
Stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com, because we put the power of the press in your hands. With one click, Liberty Nation delivers tomorrow's news.
And remember, liberty.
Today.
All the time and everywhere.
Liberty Nation connected the dots between a Chinese research biolab and a wet market where COVID-19 was supposedly discovered 2 months before the MSM. We were first to alert you of a serious attack on gun rights in Virginia. LN honed in on the Biden-Burisma scandal months before it hit the papers. We brought you exclusive interviews from the border.
We're looking at people just rising up.
Liberty Nation was on the ground in London,
Trump rally in front of the American Embassy,
bringing you on-the-scene reports about Brexit. LN reported that COVID-19 was more virulent but less deadly weeks before others. LibertyNation.com delivers tomorrow's news today with LNTV's Liberty Nation Radio, the Uprising and Rabbit Hole podcasts, and dozens of insightful original articles, and a new Roku channel. Stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com and get tomorrow's news today. LibertyNation.com.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
When the increasingly radical New York Times announced the creation of the 1619 Project a year ago to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the arrival of slaves on American shores, its impact was limited mostly to radical leftists who were already heavily committed to the deconstruction of what they believed to be an American society predicated on white supremacy. But when the George Floyd tragedy unfolded before the eyes of America and the world, suddenly the 1619 Project became a prominent narrative, as leftists, collectivists, progressives persuaded thousands, perhaps millions, of young white people already indoctrinated by anti-American educators across the land to be ashamed of themselves, to hate their own whiteness and their own heritage. Just how toxic is this view of the world, where America's transformed from being a force for good to a force for evil? How much long-term impact might it have on the perceptions of Americans and the rest of the world? Joining us to help answer those questions is a deep thinker who's devoted much of his recent thought to this 1619 project and its tentacles. And he's author of the recent article entitled The Con-Science of the 1619 Project, Onar Am of LibertyNation.com, who joins us from his native Norway. Hello, Onar.
Hi there, Tim.
It's a pleasure to have you back. As I keep telling you, it's been too long, but this whole 1619 project is based on what's called critical race theory, which turns history from the objective to the subjective. What exactly is critical race theory?
It's the brief version of it is that it's a new version of Marxism, and it came with intellectuals from Germany called the Frankfurt School. They escaped from Germany after World War II. They were Marxists, but they understood that they couldn't compete on economics ground with capitalism. So they reinvented Marxism in the name of identity politics. So they turned to, instead of setting up the working class against the capitalist class, they set up races and genders and various minorities against an oppressive system of the majority. So critical theory is basically Marxism in disguise, and critical race theory is specifically taking the sides of racial minorities and using their so-called lived experiences as a substitute for objective truth. They say that there is no truth, there is only lived experience.
Well, how can we ever get an accurate account of actual history if everyone's history is based solely on their own experience, so that actual facts get shoved to the background or even out of the conversation altogether?
That's a very good question, Tim. And the answer is that you can't, because according to critical race theory themselves, the theorists say that there is no such thing as objective truth. There is no such thing as accurate history. There's only narrative, and whoever has the most power is the one who tells the best story. And they say, well, we want the weak parties, the oppressed, to be the ones to tell the stories. So they want then the story of America to be told from the perspective of racial minorities, in particular blacks, and their experience with slavery. So they want to define history from that perspective.
Now, you write in your article, quote, "What if two people have different lived experiences? Whose personal truth takes precedence? The answer that critical race theory provides is that the arbiter of truth is victimhood. The, quote, lived experience of the greatest victim is always right." So are you saying the greatest self-perceived victims of history are the ones who should have the responsibility and privilege to write history?
That is what the critical theory theorists say. They say precisely this, that the so-called history, that objective history, is a product of white supremacy. So objectivity itself is white supremacy. So any claim of universal truth, it has to be discarded as racist, and it has to be replaced with what they perceive as the moral alternative, which is the lived experience of the so-called victim groups, and they get to define who the victims are.
Well, now, the 1619 Project, Onar, was widely criticized by serious accredited historians before it became unacceptable to criticize it after the George Floyd episode. What would you say are the most prominent historical inaccuracies in the 1619 Project narrative?
I don't actually have to have an opinion about that. I can just parrot what the historians say.
Okay, sure.
So the historians basically say that the very premise of the project, the most important, the foundation of the project, is completely false, and that is the starting article of the project is to say that the United States was in fact founded to save the institution of slavery. And that is a pure lie. They say that they were afraid that the British were going to come and abolish slavery, and that in order to save slavery, they had to create an institution that can preserve slavery. That is absurd, and it is as far away from the truth as you can get. It's pure fantasy. But as long as it can be said to be the lived experience of someone who is in the right victim group, fantasy is the truth.
Onar, in your article, you also write, and this is profound, amazingly, critical race theorists here agree with those white supremacists of the 19th century that defended slavery. The only difference is that the former regards these properties as unfavorable. So are you saying that racists and critical race theorists actually view the world through the same lens where race or victimhood is the only real factor?
It certainly appears so, and I don't actually have to use any kind of rhetoric or exaggerations. I can use their own words. The Smithsonian Institute put out a history of blacks, where they defined what whiteness was, and they said this is in a negative fashion. And they said that such things as individualism, being on time, being timely, objectivity, science, logic, reason, all of these things, and also being having a Protestant work ethic, not being lazy. All of these are signs of whiteness. And if you had asked any white supremacists in the 19th century, they would have been nodding and say, "Yup, that's
true."
Whiteness.
And so what this really reveals from the Smithsonian and like-minded people in the left-wing cultural establishments of the United States is that they're insulting black people because they're saying that black people don't have any of those qualities that you just described. Isn't that what they're really saying?
Yes. In one sense, they are white supremacists with a guilty conscience. They agree wholeheartedly with white supremacy and in every single fashion, except for one thing. They think that they are it's a bad thing to be a white supremacist, but they agree with all the statements of white supremacy.
Right. They agree with the whole context in which the human race should be viewed. I want to ask you this, living at some distance from the U.S., but studying us and seeing us from afar, but also up close. How do you react, and those that you know react, when you see these almost all-white gangs of criminals starting riots every night in the name somehow of racial justice? No action taken to stop them as they riot and try to burn down a federal courthouse and anything else they can set ablaze. How do you react to that?
Well, there are two reactions. There are those who are what I would call uninformed. They just watch the news, and the news in Europe is just a rehash of MSNBC and CNN. So they get basically no news about what's going on in America. Those who pay attention to those channels, they don't know anything about what's going on in America, and they don't understand anything. Those who pay a little bit more attention, and especially who are students of history, recognize very well what's going on in the US, because it happened in 1917 in Russia. That's the Bolshevik Revolution. It happened in China in 1949. It happened in the 1970s in Cambodia with Pol Pot, where people were murdered simply for wearing glasses. If they had actual power, which we have seen in certain cases, they would become exactly what we saw in Russia, in Cambodia, and in China. In Europe, we know this history better than Americans because we live closer to the Soviet Union. We had them next door.
Well, that's a very useful point. It's been up close and personal for people that weren't separated by an ocean from a communist tyranny. Onar, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Onar Am, LibertyNation.com. Read his stuff. It's deep and good and broad and wide and all the other good things you'd expect from LibertyNation.com. Quick break, and then we're back with Talkin' Liberty.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And now we welcome you to the ultimate portion of Liberty Nation Radio. We entitle it Talkin' Liberty. It needs no explanation, nor does the man who joins us once again now, our regular contributor, constitutional lawyer, LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor, and our guardian of individual liberty, Scott Cosenza. Hello, Scott.
Hello, Tim.
Okay, the New York Attorney General was making headlines this week. For what purpose, ultimately?
To destroy the National Rifle Association. She has sued the National Rifle Association in state court in New York. The National Rifle Association was chartered originally in 1871 by the New York legislature. That's how it got its start. It's a not-for-profit, even though it's headquartered in Northern Virginia and operates no physical offices in New York. Because of that charter, they have legal obligations for filing of financial disclosures, for instance, and other things. And that's the legal connection to New York for the organization. And Ms. Jones is a very strong progressive candidate. She was sworn in January 1, 2019. Before then, Tim, she campaigned against basically using the power of the office that she was campaigning for, Attorney General, to destroy the NRA. She thought that at that point that there may be financial impropriety, but also basically laid out some other ways in which she thought she could bring down the organization. And we know that she's now using the courts to try and do just that. She's alleged that Wayne LaPierre, the executive vice president and, sort of most prominent face of the NRA for the last number of decades, is engaged in a massive financial fraud against the organization and its members. And along with he and his cronies have basically used it as a personal piggy bank to fleece it.
What's the legitimacy of the charges as you see it? Does she have a point?
So as I write in the pages, Tim, of LibertyNation.com, more's the pity, both allegations may be true. Ms. James may have craven and even constitutionally impermissible motivations, and Mr. LaPierre and his cronies may have massively defrauded NRA members and broken the law. And I think that's probably what we have here. This is not a criminal charge. This is in civil court, and it has to do with how these nonprofits are regulated. Here's the legal kind of mechanism by which she's doing this. And let's be clear again, this is not a person who's saying that Wayne LaPierre stole money from the NRA and is criminally prosecuting them for that theft. This is a person who's saying the NRA leadership has so rotted out the organization that not only do they have to pay money, civil damages for the money they took, but we're dissolving the organization. She wishes to dissolve the National Rifle Association. And if you read the New York State not-for-profit and corporation laws, like I have, Tim, sad to say.
It's like bedtime reading for you.
Like I have, we learn that directors have the option to ask a court for dissolution of a not-for-profit corporation if they choose, and that the Attorney General, in certain instances, can stand in the place of a director. But there's nowhere that says a director should ask for the dissolution of the nation's oldest and largest and most important firearms civil rights organization because of the nefarious activities of fewer than half a dozen people. That's what we have alleged here. It would be like, Tim, if the chairman and a few high-end people at the NAACP were caught stealing money, and an attorney general wished to extinguish the organization for that. That's the analogy here.
Okay, now the Delaware Supreme Court has denied due process to photo ticket recipients. So let's take it from, a nationwide significant constitutional issue to the photo tickets that you get when you're driving.
Just the thousands of people that happen through a Delaware intersection and are victims of this ticketing, and the Delaware authorities are so, they lack such confidence in the quality of their ticketing that they will not allow people to challenge it. You don't get to go to court in Delaware if you get a photo ticket, even though it exceeds the limit. It's $100. Delaware law says basically, if you're fined more than $100, you get to go to court for your fine. If not that, you get to a district justice, which is just that's a person who's not a judge, and it's not a formal court proceeding. And this fine is $175, but it's not a $175 fine, Tim. It's only a $75 fine. Then there's court costs, this cost, that cost, processing fee, convenience fee, and such and so forth. And when you're done with all that, it adds up to $175. So
convenience.
I just threw that out. I don't know that they. I don't know that they quite have the temerity to call it that, although they could. But the point is that those fees add up to $175, which exceeds obviously the $100 that was the threshold. And the Delaware Supreme Court said that even though it's a total out-of-pocket cost of $175, that they're getting away with it by only calling $75 of it a fine. And the point is, Tim, they have these systems set up. It's a for-profit company that sets up the camera, that operates it, and they're wholly motivated for one thing: more violations, less resistance to violations, less resistance to or no appeals for violations. But the people of Delaware that govern Delaware are supposed to be about the law and good order and liberty for Delawareans and people who visit Delaware, which is the exact opposite of what we have with the camera operators.
New York City police union sue to block the city's chokehold ban.
Well, it's all there in the headline, Tim. I mean, there's not much to it beyond that. They say that this is unconstitutionally vague, the law that they have been charged now with enforcing, which doesn't allow, colloquially speaking, chokeholds or pressure applied to the windpipe or carotid artery. And they say it's unconstitutionally vague. Now, it's just one of those things. I throw it out there to say that even that regulation, and when you read it, it seems fairly clear what can and can't be done in terms of the way you treat a suspect. But, this is one of those things where if there were any goodwill left with these union representatives, perhaps there could be room to say, well, gee, is there some issue there? But unfortunately, they just seem to resist and deny with any kind of reform measure.
Okay, Scott. Ground zero for the insurrection that we're seeing in cities across the land now was, of course, Minneapolis, site of the George Floyd execution, whatever you want to call it. And, of course, that's where the defund police movement began. They want to overhaul the police. There's a great deal of momentum behind it. But now the plan's going to be delayed for at least another year. How come?
Oh, well, the politicians thought it would be easier to kick the can down the road than to do the hard work of actually exercising
But they were
reform.
unanimously in favor of it.
Oh, they were unanimously in favor of tweeting and putting Instagram posts, and they did all that. So that was they exercised their support in that regard.
Went out, painted some murals,
put
Black Lives Matter
things.
On the
Tim,
sidewalk.
they expressed and signaled their virtue.
What more can you do as a politician, Scott? Isn't that what they're elected to do?
They're going to talk about that in 2021, what more they can do.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Tim.
This program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcasts, The Uprising, hosted by Scott, and The Rabbit Hole with Mark Angelides, where past is prologue. All of them available on demand at LibertyNation.com and from fine podcast providers everywhere. So that is it for this week, but we'll be back at you next week, same time, same station. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying, now more than ever, stand up for liberty. And we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.